Hello everyone, welcome. The global geopolitical landscape is increasingly defined by the rivalry between the United States and China, a competition that has moved beyond traditional diplomacy into the realms of trade, technology, and economic statecraft. Caught in the middle of this contest is the European Union, which finds itself in an increasingly precarious position. In September 2025, top negotiators from the United States and China, including U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, met in Madrid, Spain. While the Spanish foreign minister celebrated hosting the dialogue, the event served as a powerful symbol of Europe's diminishing geopolitical relevance. The world's two largest economies were negotiating the terms of their trade and technology wars, including a framework deal for the future of the globally popular Chinese-owned app TikTok on European soil without any meaningful European participation. This was not an isolated incident but the culmination of a summer where the EU felt bullied by Washington's demands and ignored by Beijing's assertiveness. The scene in Madrid brought to life the frequent warnings of former EU diplomats that Europe must choose between being a geostrategic actor or merely the playground where others compete. The fact that Washington and Beijing were ironing out their disputes in a European capital, while Europe was largely sidelined, suggests the continent is increasingly becoming the latter. While the Europeans were not at the table, there was a distinct sense that they were on the menu. The European Union is caught in a strategic bind, wedged between its indispensable security ally, the United States, and its vital economic partner, China. This forces the EU to perform a difficult balancing act, as both superpowers pressure it to align with their interests. The transatlantic relationship has been strained by aggressive U.S. policies, particularly under the Trump administration. The U.S. has not only engaged in a massive trade war with China but has also used tariffs as a tool against its European allies. Washington has consistently pressured Europe to adopt a tougher stance on China, demanding alignment on issues from technology and intellectual property to human rights. A recent and telling example is President Trump's public demand for European nations to impose 50% to 100% tariffs on all Chinese goods as part of a joint strategy against Russia. This maximalist proposal, which ignores the fact that the U.S. itself had negotiated its own tariffs down to 30% from a peak of 145%, was met in Brussels with a decisive rejection. EU diplomats privately stated there was no way they would implement such a policy, which they view as a violation of WTO rules and a dangerous escalation that would harm the European economy more than it would pressure Russia or China. This episode highlights a fundamental disconnect, with Washington making demands that Brussels views as both unserious and counterproductive. Beijing, for its part, has skillfully used its economic leverage to prevent a united transatlantic front. While the EU has labeled China a partner, competitor, and systemic rival, China has focused on deepening economic ties and exploiting divisions within the 27-member bloc. When faced with U.S. pressure, China has demonstrated its willingness to weaponize its dominance in critical supply chains. For instance, in response to U.S. tariffs, China temporarily suspended exports of rare earth metals and magnets, which are essential for European industries like electric vehicles (EVs), wind turbines, and defense manufacturing. This blackmail, as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called it, rattled European capitals and served as a stark reminder of their dependencies. Beijing later used the resumption of these supplies as a bargaining chip, successfully negotiating an upgraded export supply mechanism with the EU to fast-track licenses, a move that showcases Europe's reactive negotiating posture. The EU's greatest weakness in this great power competition is its own internal disunity. The 27 member states often have diverging economic interests and threat perceptions, which China has been adept at exploiting. While some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, have adopted a more hawkish view of China, others, like Germany, prioritize their deep economic ties. This division was starkly illustrated during the 2024 debate over imposing tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. The European Commission proposed duties to counter Chinese state subsidies, but the final decision revealed a deep split. 10 countries voted in favor, 12 abstained, and 5, including the economic powerhouse Germany, voted against the measures, fearing retaliation against their automotive industry. This strategic paralysis is reflected in the EU's official policy toward China, defined by the triptych of partner, competitor, systemic rival. This framework, while nuanced, also reveals an institution struggling to formulate a single, coherent strategy. The long-held ambition of achieving strategic autonomy, the ability to act independently on the world stage, remains largely aspirational. The war in Ukraine has brutally exposed the EU's continued military dependence on the United States, while the US-China trade war has highlighted its economic vulnerabilities. The EU's own Strategic Foresight Report 2025 grimly concludes that a return to the previous status quo seems increasingly unlikely and that the rules-based international order is eroding. Yet the path to genuine autonomy remains fraught with challenges. The US-China rivalry is being fought most intensely on the economic and technological fronts, with significant spillover effects for Europe. The trade war, initiated by the US in 2018 with tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, has had a complex impact on Europe. In theory, it presented an opportunity for trade diversion, where EU exporters could capture market share in the US and China as the two rivals taxed each other's goods. One UNCTAD study estimated the EU could gain as much as $70 billion in exports. However, the reality has been less favorable. An analysis by the European Central Bank found that the euro area did not substantially increase its share of the US import market in the wake of the tariffs. Instead, Europe faced the dual risk of supply chain disruptions and the potential for Chinese goods shut out of the US market being dumped into Europe, creating intense competition for domestic firms. As Chinese exporters sought alternative markets, China's share of euro area imports grew more rapidly after the US tariffs were imposed. An even more critical front is the battle for technological supremacy. U.S. restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductors and chip manufacturing equipment to China have had extraterritorial effects, impacting European companies integrated into global tech supply chains. The debate over allowing Chinese firm Huawei to build 5G networks across Europe was an early example of the continent being squeezed between U.S. security warnings and Chinese commercial offers. The ongoing saga of TikTok is the latest flashpoint. The U.S. ban, citing national security risks, and the subsequent negotiations between Washington and Beijing over a divestment deal underscore how technology, data, and geopolitics have become inseparable. The fact that the framework for this deal was negotiated in Madrid, linking the app's fate to the broader trade war, places Europe firmly on the sidelines of a critical geotechnological contest. Despite its reactive posture, the EU is not standing entirely still. There is a growing recognition in Brussels that it must develop its own tools to navigate this new era of geoeconomics. The EU's official strategy is now one of de-risking, not decoupling. This approach aims to reduce critical dependencies on single suppliers like China, for instance, in critical raw materials, batteries, and pharmaceuticals, without severing economic ties altogether. To this end, the EU is strengthening its policy arsenal. This includes more robust trade defense instruments, foreign investment screening mechanisms, and new tools to ensure reciprocity in public procurement, which have already been used to challenge Chinese firms. The controversial tariffs on Chinese EVs, while divisive, signal a newfound willingness in Brussels to act more assertively, to protect its industrial base, even at the risk of retaliation. The EU and key member states like France, Germany, and the Netherlands are also belatedly turning their attention to the Indo-Pacific, the central theater of US-China competition. By adopting Indo-Pacific strategies, they aim to diversify partnerships, secure supply chains, and play a larger role in regional security, for example, by participating in maritime domain awareness initiatives. This reflects a broader recognition that Europe's prosperity and security are inextricably linked to developments in Asia. However, the path from playground to player is steep. The EU's efforts are hampered by resource constraints, internal divisions, and the sheer scale of the US-China rivalry. The unpredictability of U.S. policy, especially with the potential return of a Trump administration, further complicates long-term strategic planning. The Madrid talks serve as a sobering reminder that unless the EU can translate its economic weight into unified political power, it risks being permanently sidelined in a world order, being reshaped by others. The choice, as one diplomat put it, remains stark: to be a player or to be the playground.